Marcus Chen had always been the person others forgot about in meetings. While his colleagues at the National Weather Service argued about storm tracking models and competed for prime television appearances, Marcus sat quietly in the corner, methodically analyzing atmospheric pressure readings that most people found mind-numbingly boring. His cubicle was tucked away in the basement level of the Denver facility, surrounded by humming computers and walls, covered with barometric charts that looked like abstract art to anyone who didn't understand meteorology. The irony wasn't lost on him that someone whose job involved predicting when people should stay grounded spent most of his free time dreaming about taking flight. Marcus had been fascinated by aviation since childhood, but his path had led him into atmospheric science instead of piloting. His parents had pushed him toward what they called stable career choices, and weather forecasting seemed safer than the uncertain world of aviation. Now, at 32, Marcus wondered if he had chosen security over passion. Every morning, Marcus arrived at work an hour before his colleagues, not because he was particularly ambitious, but because he enjoyed the quiet time to review overnight weather data without interruption. The basement office felt like a cocoon, where he could focus entirely on the intricate patterns that governed atmospheric behavior. While other meteorologists specialized in dramatic events like tornadoes and hurricanes, Marcus had developed an unusual expertise in microclimate analysis and the subtle atmospheric variations that affected aviation safety. His supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, had worked in weather services for 25 years and had seen countless meteorologists come and go. She noticed that Marcus possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect atmospheric anomalies that computer models missed. His reports were consistently accurate, but they lacked the dramatic flair that made for compelling television forecasts. Janet often assigned Marcus to handle the routine briefings that nobody else wanted, particularly the technical consultations with small regional airports. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Marcus was analyzing pressure gradient data when his computer flagged an unusual atmospheric disturbance developing over the eastern Colorado plains. The meteorological models suggested clear skies, but Marcus noticed subtle pressure variations that indicated potential turbulence in what should have been calm air. He spent 3 hours double-checking his calculations, running additional atmospheric simulations, and cross-referencing historical weather patterns. When Marcus finally approached Janet with his findings, she was juggling phone calls about a weather system moving through Kansas. She barely glanced at his detailed report before dismissing his concerns. The computer models showed favorable flying conditions, and she didn't have time to investigate what appeared to be minor atmospheric irregularities. Marcus returned to his desk feeling frustrated but not entirely surprised. His meticulous approach to weather analysis rarely generated the kind of immediate urgency that captured management attention. That afternoon, Marcus received a call from Sarah Mitchell, operations manager at Rocky Mountain Regional Airport, a small facility that served private aircraft and flight training operations. The airport relied on Marcus for detailed weather briefings because his analysis was consistently more accurate than standard forecasts. Sarah trusted his judgment implicitly, having learned over 2 years of working with him that Marcus caught atmospheric problems that other meteorologists missed. Rocky Mountain Regional was planning to host a vintage aircraft exhibition that weekend, featuring restored planes from the 1,942nd and 1,952nd. The event would attract pilots from across the region, including several flying rare aircraft worth millions of dollars. Sarah needed Marcus to provide hourly weather updates because vintage aircraft were particularly sensitive to atmospheric conditions that modern planes could handle easily. Marcus explained his concerns about the atmospheric anomaly he had detected. While official forecasts predicted ideal flying conditions, his analysis suggested that pilots might encounter unexpected turbulence in specific altitude ranges. Sarah listened carefully, taking notes, as Marcus described the meteorological factors that could create dangerous flying conditions despite apparently clear skies. After hanging up, Marcus continued monitoring the atmospheric data, watching as the pressure variations he had identified earlier began intensifying exactly as his calculations predicted. The disturbance was subtle enough that standard weather models wouldn't detect it until much later, but Marcus could see the pattern developing hours ahead of conventional forecasting systems. By late afternoon, Marcus had documented a clear atmospheric anomaly that would create severe turbulence conditions between 3,000 and 8,000 feet altitude, precisely the range where vintage aircraft would be operating during the weekend exhibition. The turbulence would be invisible to pilots until they encountered it, making the situation particularly hazardous for older aircraft with less sophisticated instrumentation. Marcus called Sarah again, this time with more urgent concerns. He recommended that the vintage aircraft exhibition be postponed until Monday, when atmospheric conditions would stabilize. Sarah appreciated his diligence but explained that postponing the event would cost the airport thousands of dollars and disappoint hundreds of aviation enthusiasts who had traveled from distant states to attend. Instead, Sarah proposed a compromise. If Marcus could provide real-time weather monitoring during the exhibition, alerting pilots to specific atmospheric conditions as they developed, the event could proceed safely. She offered to pay Marcus consulting fees for weekend work. But more importantly, she suggested he might want to experience the aviation community firsthand, rather than just providing weather support from his basement office. The invitation intrigued Marcus more than he wanted to admit. He had spent years supporting aviation through meteorological analysis but had never actually participated in the flying community. His knowledge of atmospheric conditions was theoretical, based on data rather than personal experience. The opportunity to see how pilots actually used weather information in real-world flying situations appealed to his scientific curiosity. Marcus agreed to provide on-site weather support for the vintage aircraft exhibition. Sarah arranged for him to have access to the airport's weather station and communication equipment, allowing him to monitor atmospheric conditions and communicate directly with pilots as needed. She also mentioned that several experienced pilots would be available to answer any questions Marcus might have about aviation operations. That evening, Marcus researched the vintage aircraft that would be participating in the exhibition. He studied the performance characteristics of different plane models, learning how atmospheric conditions affected aircraft with varying wing configurations, engine types, and instrumentation systems. The research revealed just how much his meteorological expertise could contribute to aviation safety when applied with proper understanding of aircraft capabilities. Marcus had always approached weather forecasting as an abstract intellectual exercise, but preparing for the vintage aircraft exhibition forced him to consider the practical implications of atmospheric conditions on human lives and expensive equipment. The responsibility felt heavier than his usual work, but also more meaningful. Instead of generating routine forecasts that most people ignored, he would be providing critical safety information that pilots would depend on for successful flights. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Rocky Mountain Regional Airport before dawn, carrying portable weather monitoring equipment and a detailed atmospheric analysis he had prepared overnight. The airport was bustling with activity as vintage aircraft owners prepared their planes for the exhibition. Marcus set up his equipment in the control tower, where he would have clear radio communication with all aircraft and direct observation of flying conditions. As the sun rose, Marcus watched pilots performing pre-flight inspections on beautiful restored aircraft that looked like they had stepped out of aviation history. He noticed how carefully the pilots examined every detail of their planes, checking control surfaces, engine components, and instrumentation with the same meticulous attention that Marcus applied to atmospheric data analysis. The parallel between their approaches impressed him. Sarah introduced Marcus to Tom Bradley, a retired airline pilot who now flew a restored 1947 Cessna 195. Tom had 40 years of flying experience and immediately recognized the value of having a dedicated meteorologist providing real-time weather analysis. He invited Marcus to observe his pre-flight weather briefing, explaining how pilots interpreted meteorological information for flight planning purposes. Marcus was fascinated to learn how pilots synthesized weather data with aircraft performance characteristics, route planning, and safety margins to make flying decisions. Tom's approach combined scientific analysis with practical experience in ways that Marcus had never considered. The conversation revealed gaps in Marcus's understanding of how atmospheric conditions actually affected flying operations. When Tom mentioned that he occasionally took passengers on educational flights to help people understand aviation, Marcus felt a sudden surge of interest. The opportunity to experience atmospheric conditions from a pilot's perspective, rather than just analyzing them from ground-based instruments, seemed like the missing piece in his meteorological education. Tom noticed Marcus's enthusiasm and casually suggested that they might arrange a flight sometime after the exhibition concluded. The vintage aircraft exhibition officially began at 10 o'clock, with pilots taking off in sequence for a formation flight demonstration. Marcus monitored atmospheric conditions constantly, noting how his predicted turbulence zones were developing exactly as his calculations had indicated. He provided real-time weather updates to pilots, alerting them to specific altitude ranges where they should expect rough air. The first few flights proceeded smoothly, with pilots reporting conditions that matched Marcus's forecasts precisely. His confidence grew as he realized that his meteorological expertise was providing genuine value to the aviation community. The pilots appreciated having detailed, accurate weather information that went far beyond standard forecasts. And Marcus enjoyed seeing the practical application of his scientific knowledge. Around noon, Marcus detected atmospheric changes that his morning analysis hadn't fully predicted. A thermal inversion was developing more rapidly than expected, creating potentially dangerous wind shear conditions near the airport. He immediately contacted all airborne aircraft, recommending that they avoid approaches from the southeast until the atmospheric disturbance passed. Tom Bradley was returning from the formation flight when Marcus issued the wind shear warning. Instead of attempting the standard approach pattern, Tom followed Marcus's recommendation to circle west of the airport until conditions improved. Other pilots also heeded Marcus's advice, delaying their landings by 15 minutes while the atmospheric disturbance dissipated. The incident demonstrated the critical importance of real-time meteorological analysis for aviation safety. Standard weather forecasts would not have detected the rapidly developing wind shear conditions, but Marcus's continuous monitoring and atmospheric expertise prevented potentially dangerous landing attempts. Sarah was impressed by Marcus's proactive approach and the pilot's trust in his weather guidance. After the exhibition concluded successfully without any weather-related incidents, Tom Bradley approached Marcus with renewed appreciation for his meteorological skills. Tom explained that most pilots received only basic weather training and relied on simplified forecasts that often missed the subtle atmospheric conditions that Marcus monitored. He suggested that Marcus's expertise could benefit the broader aviation community if he understood flying operations better. Tom's invitation for an educational flight suddenly seemed less like casual conversation and more like a genuine opportunity for professional development. Marcus realized that his meteorological career had reached a plateau because he understood atmospheric science in isolation from its practical applications. Learning to fly would provide the missing context that could transform his weather forecasting from academic exercise into essential safety service. That evening, Marcus called Tom to accept the invitation for an educational flight. They scheduled a 2-hour flight for the following weekend, with Tom planning to demonstrate how different atmospheric conditions affected aircraft performance and handling characteristics. Marcus would finally experience firsthand the atmospheric phenomena he had spent years analyzing from his basement office. As Marcus drove home from the airport, he reflected on how dramatically his perspective had changed in just one day. The vintage aircraft exhibition had transformed weather forecasting from abstract data analysis into personal responsibility for human safety. He had discovered a community of people who valued his expertise and could help him understand the practical applications of meteorological science. For the first time in his career, Marcus felt genuinely excited about the intersection between his scientific knowledge and its real-world impact. The atmospheric conditions he studied weren't just academic curiosities but factors that determined whether pilots could fly safely or should remain grounded. The responsibility was sobering but also energizing. Marcus began planning how he could expand his meteorological services to better serve the aviation community. He envisioned developing specialized weather briefings for different types of aircraft, creating atmospheric analysis tools specifically designed for pilots, and possibly even pursuing flight training to better understand the pilot perspective on weather conditions. The weekend had shown Marcus that his patient, methodical approach to atmospheric science was exactly what the aviation community needed, but he had been applying it in isolation from the people who could benefit most from his expertise. The vintage aircraft exhibition had connected him with pilots who appreciated detailed weather analysis and could help him understand how to make his forecasts more useful for flight operations. As Marcus prepared for his educational flight with Tom Bradley, he felt like he was finally embarking on the career path that combined his scientific expertise with his long-suppressed passion for aviation. The weather specialist who had been overlooked in conference rooms was about to discover how his atmospheric knowledge could transform him into someone the flying community would never forget. Marcus arrived at Rocky Mountain Regional Airport the following Saturday morning with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that he hadn't felt since graduate school. His weather monitoring equipment sat unused in his car, as he focused entirely on the prospect of his first flight experience. Tom Bradley was already at the hangar, performing a thorough pre-flight inspection of his restored Cessna 195, a beautiful silver aircraft with classic lines that spoke to aviation's golden age. Tom had been flying for 4 decades, starting as a military pilot before transitioning to commercial aviation, and finally retiring to pursue his passion for vintage aircraft restoration. His approach to flight preparation was methodical and patient, qualities that immediately resonated with Marcus's scientific temperament. Tom explained each step of the pre-flight inspection, describing how pilots evaluated aircraft systems and anticipated potential problems before they became serious safety issues. The Cessna 195 was particularly well suited for Marcus's introduction to flying because its simple instrumentation and stable flight characteristics provided an excellent platform for understanding how atmospheric conditions affected aircraft performance. Tom had chosen this specific airplane not just for its historical significance, but because it responded predictably to pilot inputs and weather conditions, making it ideal for educational flights. As they completed the pre-flight inspection, Tom quizzed Marcus about current atmospheric conditions, encouraging him to apply his meteorological expertise to flight planning. Marcus described the pressure systems, wind patterns, and thermal activity he had observed that morning, translating abstract weather data into practical implications for their planned flight route. Tom was impressed by Marcus's detailed understanding of atmospheric dynamics and his ability to predict how those conditions would affect flying operations. The flight began with Tom handling all aircraft controls while Marcus observed from the right seat, learning to interpret the relationship between atmospheric conditions and aircraft behavior. As they climbed through different altitude levels, Marcus experienced firsthand the atmospheric phenomena he had previously only studied through instrument readings and computer models. The smooth air near the surface gave way to gentle turbulence as they encountered thermal updrafts, then returned to stability at cruise altitude, where atmospheric conditions were more uniform. Tom explained how pilots used weather information for real-time flight decisions, constantly evaluating atmospheric conditions and adjusting their plans accordingly. Unlike Marcus's ground-based weather analysis, which focused on broad regional patterns, pilots needed immediate, localized weather information that affected their specific flight path and timing. The perspective shift was revelatory for Marcus, who began understanding how his meteorological expertise could be more effectively applied to aviation safety. During the flight, Marcus noticed how different types of atmospheric disturbances affected the aircraft in ways that matched his theoretical knowledge, but provided entirely new sensory experiences. Wind shear created sudden changes in aircraft performance that he felt through the controls, while thermal turbulence produced vertical movements that demonstrated the three-dimensional nature of atmospheric dynamics he had previously only understood intellectually. Tom gradually began allowing Marcus to handle the aircraft controls, starting with simple, straight and level flight, and progressing to basic turns and altitude changes. Marcus was surprised by how quickly he adapted to aircraft control, discovering that his systematic analytical approach translated well to flying techniques. The precise inputs required for smooth aircraft control appealed to the same methodical mindset that made him an excellent meteorologist. As Marcus gained confidence with basic aircraft handling, Tom introduced more complex flight maneuvers that demonstrated how atmospheric conditions influenced pilot decision-making. They practiced approaches and landings at different airspeeds and configurations, with Tom explaining how wind conditions, density, altitude, and atmospheric stability affected aircraft performance during critical phases of flight. The educational flight lasted nearly 3 hours, far longer than originally planned, because Marcus proved to be an exceptionally attentive student with relevant background knowledge that accelerated his learning curve. Tom recognized that Marcus's meteorological expertise provided a foundation for understanding aviation that most beginning pilots lacked. Instead of memorizing weather-related flight rules without understanding their scientific basis, Marcus could apply atmospheric science principles to flight operations. When they finally landed back at Rocky Mountain Regional, Marcus felt transformed by the experience. Flying had connected his abstract meteorological knowledge to visceral understanding of how atmospheric conditions affected real aircraft operations. The atmospheric disturbances he studied through computer models were no longer theoretical concepts but tangible forces that influenced aircraft performance and flight safety. Tom suggested that Marcus consider pursuing a private pilot license, arguing that formal flight training would enhance his value to the aviation meteorology community while providing personal satisfaction. Tom offered to provide additional instruction if Marcus decided to begin flight training, noting that students with strong scientific backgrounds often progressed rapidly through pilot certification requirements. The prospect of learning to fly appealed to Marcus more than he had expected. The combination of technical knowledge, practical skills, and ongoing learning opportunities reminded him of what had originally attracted him to meteorological science. Flight training would also provide professional development benefits, allowing him to understand pilot needs and perspectives in ways that would improve his weather forecasting services. Marcus spent the following week researching flight training requirements and costs, investigating how pilot certification would complement his meteorological career. He discovered that relatively few meteorologists held pilot licenses, creating opportunities for specialization in aviation weather services. The combination of atmospheric science expertise and pilot qualifications could open career paths that conventional meteorology alone wouldn't provide. Sarah Mitchell noticed Marcus's increased enthusiasm when he called to provide weather briefings for Rocky Mountain Regional. His reports now included pilot-specific recommendations that went beyond standard meteorological forecasts, incorporating insights from his flight experience about how atmospheric conditions affected different types of aircraft operations. Sarah was impressed by the practical improvements in Marcus's weather services and encouraged him to consider expanding his aviation meteorology consulting. Marcus contacted Tom Bradley later that week to express serious interest in beginning flight training. Tom was delighted by Marcus's decision and offered to structure a training program that would emphasize the meteorological aspects of flying while covering all requirements for private pilot certification. They scheduled twice-weekly lessons that would allow Marcus to progress steadily through flight training while maintaining his full-time meteorology position. The flight training began immediately, with Tom developing a curriculum that integrated atmospheric science principles with practical flying skills. Marcus learned aircraft systems, navigation techniques, and flight regulations, while continuously applying his meteorological knowledge to flight planning and decision-making. His scientific background accelerated his understanding of aircraft performance, weight and balance calculations, and navigation principles. Marcus discovered that flight training provided mental challenges and satisfaction that his meteorology career had been missing. Each lesson involved problem-solving, risk assessment, and technical skill development that engaged different aspects of his intellect. The combination of theoretical knowledge and practical application created a learning environment that Marcus found intellectually stimulating and personally rewarding. After 2 months of regular flight instruction, Marcus had progressed through basic aircraft control techniques and was beginning cross-country navigation training. Tom was impressed by Marcus's systematic approach to flight planning, which incorporated detailed weather analysis beyond what most pilots attempted. Marcus would prepare comprehensive atmospheric briefings for training flights, identifying potential weather hazards and alternative plans with professional-level thoroughness. Marcus's colleagues at the National Weather Service noticed changes in his work performance and enthusiasm. His weather briefings became more detailed and practical, incorporating pilot perspectives that made his forecasts more useful for aviation customers. Janet Rodriguez observed that Marcus seemed more confident and engaged, participating more actively in staff meetings and volunteering for challenging assignments he had previously avoided. The transformation was particularly evident when Marcus received a call from Denver International Airport requesting specialized weather analysis for a series of test flights involving experimental aircraft. The assignment required detailed atmospheric modeling and real-time weather monitoring that matched Marcus's technical strengths, but also needed someone who understood pilot requirements and flight operations. Marcus's combination of meteorological expertise and flight training made him uniquely qualified for the project. Marcus's work at Denver International Airport involved supporting test flights for a new regional aircraft design that was particularly sensitive to atmospheric turbulence and wind conditions. The aircraft manufacturer needed precise weather analysis to validate performance specifications and identify atmospheric conditions that might affect certification requirements. Marcus provided detailed atmospheric modeling and real-time weather monitoring that enabled successful completion of the test flight program. The success of the Denver International Project led to additional consulting opportunities with aircraft manufacturers, flight testing organizations, and aviation research facilities. Marcus discovered a specialized market for meteorological services that required both atmospheric science expertise and understanding of flight operations. His unique qualifications allowed him to command premium consulting fees while working on projects that combined his professional skills with his growing passion for aviation. Marcus's flight training progressed rapidly, with Tom noting that his meteorological background provided advantages in understanding weather-related flight planning and decision-making that most student pilots struggled to master. Marcus approached flight training with the same methodical preparation that characterized his scientific work, studying aircraft systems and flight procedures with thoroughness that impressed his instructor. After 6 months of flight training, Marcus was approaching readiness for his private pilot check ride, the practical examination required for pilot certification. Tom had observed Marcus's flying skills develop to the point where he could safely operate aircraft in normal weather conditions, but more importantly, Marcus had demonstrated the judgment and decision-making skills essential for safe pilot operations. The check ride preparation involved intensive review of flight procedures, emergency protocols, and weather-related decision-making scenarios. Marcus's meteorological expertise gave him significant advantages in the weather-related portions of pilot testing, but he needed to demonstrate proficiency in aircraft control and navigation that required pure flying experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Marcus's approach to check ride preparation reflected his scientific training, with systematic review of all potential test scenarios and thorough preparation for questions about flight regulations, aircraft systems, and emergency procedures. He practiced flight maneuvers repeatedly until they became automatic responses, applying the same dedication to skill development that had made him successful in meteorological analysis. The day of Marcus's check ride arrived with weather conditions that perfectly demonstrated his ability to integrate meteorological analysis with flight planning. Tom observed the examination process, noting how Marcus's detailed weather briefing impressed the designated examiner and how his precise aircraft control reflected months of methodical training and practice. Marcus passed his private pilot check ride on the first attempt, earning certification that officially qualified him as a pilot while maintaining his professional meteorology career. The achievement represented more than personal accomplishment. It marked his transformation from theoretical weather analyst to practical aviation professional who could bridge the gap between atmospheric science and flight operations. Tom Bradley celebrated Marcus's certification by arranging a cross-country flight that would allow him to apply his new pilot skills while exercising meteorological expertise for flight planning. They planned a route that would encounter various atmospheric conditions, providing Marcus with opportunities to experience how different weather systems affected cross-country flight operations. The celebration flight took them across Colorado and into New Mexico, with Marcus serving as pilot in command, while Tom provided guidance and safety oversight. Marcus demonstrated competent flying skills and exceptional weather analysis, identifying atmospheric conditions and making flight decisions that impressed his instructor with their thoroughness and accuracy. During the flight, Marcus realized that his meteorological knowledge provided significant safety advantages when combined with pilot training. He could identify atmospheric hazards before they became critical, plan routes that avoided dangerous weather conditions, and make informed decisions about flight timing based on comprehensive understanding of atmospheric dynamics. The combination of pilot certification and meteorological expertise positioned Marcus for career opportunities that neither qualification alone would have provided. Aviation weather consulting, flight instruction with meteorological emphasis, and specialized services for experimental aircraft programs all became viable career paths that could provide both financial rewards and personal satisfaction. Marcus returned from his celebration flight with clear vision of how his career would evolve. The patient, methodical meteorologist who had been overlooked in conference rooms was becoming a pilot whose unique combination of skills would make him invaluable to the aviation community. His transformation from weather specialist to aviator was creating opportunities that would establish his reputation throughout the flying world. 6 months after earning his private pilot license, Marcus Chen found himself facing a situation that would test every skill he had developed as both meteorologist and aviator. The call came on a Tuesday evening from Captain Elena Rodriguez, chief pilot for Mountain Air Medical, a helicopter emergency medical service based in Colorado Springs. Elena had heard about Marcus through aviation networks that recognized his unique combination of meteorological expertise and pilot qualifications. Mountain Air Medical was planning to transport a critically injured child from a remote ranch in southeastern Colorado to Denver Children's Hospital, a flight that would normally be routine for their experienced helicopter crews. However, a complex weather system was developing across the flight route, creating atmospheric conditions that challenged conventional weather forecasting and threatened to ground the medical helicopter when every minute counted for the patient's survival. Elena explained that the child had suffered severe injuries in an all-terrain vehicle accident at a ranch located 80 miles from the nearest hospital with pediatric trauma capabilities. Ground transportation would require over 3 hours through mountain roads, while helicopter transport could deliver the patient to specialized medical care in 45 minutes. The timing difference could determine whether the child lived or died, making the flight decision critical. The weather system causing complications involved multiple atmospheric disturbances that were interacting in ways that confused standard forecasting models. A low-pressure system moving in from the Pacific Northwest was colliding with a high-pressure ridge over the eastern plains, creating unstable atmospheric conditions with embedded thunderstorms, wind shear, and rapidly changing visibility. Standard weather services were providing conflicting forecasts, leaving medical helicopter crews uncertain about flight safety. Marcus immediately began analyzing current atmospheric data, applying advanced meteorological techniques that went beyond standard weather forecasting. He accessed specialized atmospheric models, satellite imagery, and real-time weather observations to develop a comprehensive picture of the evolving weather system. His analysis revealed narrow windows of acceptable flying conditions that conventional forecasts were missing, along with specific atmospheric hazards that required precise timing to avoid. Elena was impressed by Marcus's detailed weather analysis but needed more than theoretical forecasting. She requested that Marcus provide real-time weather guidance throughout the medical flight, monitoring atmospheric conditions continuously and advising helicopter crews about changing weather patterns along their route. The responsibility would require Marcus to make split-second decisions about flight safety based on rapidly evolving atmospheric data. Marcus accepted the assignment, recognizing that his unique qualifications made him perhaps the only meteorologist in the region who could provide the specialized weather support required for the medical helicopter mission. He drove immediately to Mountain Air Medical's operations center, bringing portable weather monitoring equipment and establishing direct communication links with multiple atmospheric data sources. The medical helicopter crew consisted of Captain Rodriguez, co-pilot Jake Martinez, flight nurse Amanda Foster, and paramedic Dr. Sarah Kim. All were experienced medical aviation professionals who understood that weather-related flight decisions could mean the difference between successful patient transport and tragic accidents. They welcomed Marcus's meteorological expertise while making clear that ultimate flight safety decisions remained with the pilot in command. Marcus established a weather monitoring station in the operations center, connecting multiple atmospheric data feeds to create real-time weather analysis capabilities that exceeded anything available through standard aviation weather services. He began tracking the complex weather system's development, identifying atmospheric patterns that would affect helicopter operations at low altitudes, where medical aircraft typically operated. The initial weather briefing revealed that the most direct route to the ranch would encounter severe thunderstorms and dangerous wind conditions, making that flight path impossible for helicopter operations. However, Marcus identified an alternative route that would avoid the worst atmospheric disturbances by flying at specific altitudes and timing the flight to coincide with temporary improvements in weather conditions. Captain Rodriguez was initially skeptical about attempting the flight under such challenging weather conditions, but Marcus's detailed atmospheric analysis provided confidence that safe passage was possible if the timing and route selection were precisely executed. Marcus's pilot qualifications allowed him to understand the helicopter's performance limitations and communicate weather information in terms that flight crews could immediately apply to operational decisions. The medical team departed for the ranch using Marcus's recommended route, with continuous weather updates provided through aircraft communication systems. Marcus monitored atmospheric conditions along their flight path minute by minute, watching for changes that might require route adjustments or emergency landing decisions. His real-time weather guidance allowed the helicopter crew to navigate safely through rapidly changing atmospheric conditions. The flight to the ranch proceeded successfully, with Marcus's weather routing allowing the helicopter to avoid dangerous atmospheric disturbances while maintaining acceptable flight conditions. The crew landed at the ranch during a brief weather window that Marcus had predicted would provide safe helicopter operations for approximately 20 minutes before conditions deteriorated again. While medical personnel stabilized the injured child for transport, Marcus continued monitoring atmospheric conditions and planning the return flight to Denver Children's Hospital. The weather system had intensified during the outbound flight, creating new atmospheric hazards that required modified routing and precise timing for safe helicopter operations back to the city. Marcus's analysis revealed that the return flight would be more challenging than the initial journey, with thunderstorms developing along the direct route and wind conditions strengthening throughout the region. He identified a circuitous flight path that would add 15 minutes to the flight time, but avoid the most dangerous atmospheric disturbances, balancing patient care urgency with flight safety requirements. The medical team lifted off from the ranch with the stabilized patient, following Marcus's recommended routing, while he provided continuous weather updates about changing atmospheric conditions. The flight encountered moderate turbulence and reduced visibility, but Marcus's precise weather guidance allowed the helicopter crew to maintain safe flight conditions throughout the challenging return journey. Halfway through the return flight, Marcus detected rapidly developing atmospheric conditions that threatened to block their planned route with dangerous thunderstorms. He immediately contacted the helicopter crew with alternative routing recommendations, directing them to adjust their flight path to avoid areas where wind shear and severe turbulence were developing. The course correction added 10 minutes to their flight time, but ensured continued flight safety. The helicopter arrived at Denver Children's Hospital during another brief weather window that Marcus had identified through his continuous atmospheric monitoring. The successful medical transport delivered the injured child to specialized trauma care within the critical time window required for optimal medical outcomes. Marcus's weather expertise had enabled a life-saving flight that conventional weather forecasting would have grounded due to safety concerns. Captain Rodriguez was profoundly impressed by Marcus's meteorological support, noting that his real-time weather guidance had provided flight safety margins that standard weather services couldn't match. She immediately recommended Marcus to other medical helicopter services and emergency aviation organizations throughout the region, recognizing that his unique qualifications could benefit countless emergency flight operations. The successful medical helicopter mission marked the beginning of Marcus's reputation as the meteorologist that emergency aviation services called when standard weather forecasting wasn't sufficient. Word spread quickly through aviation networks about the weather specialist who could provide flight safety guidance in conditions that grounded other aircraft, leading to consulting requests from helicopter services, search and rescue organizations, and critical patient transport companies. Marcus established a specialized consulting practice focused on emergency aviation weather support, combining his meteorological expertise with pilot understanding to provide services that no other weather professional in the region could match. His business model involved real-time weather monitoring and flight guidance for aircraft operations that required precision atmospheric analysis beyond conventional forecasting capabilities. The consulting practice grew rapidly as aviation organizations discovered the safety and operational advantages that Marcus's specialized weather services provided. Emergency medical helicopter companies retained his services for challenging weather missions. Search and rescue teams consulted him for operations in marginal atmospheric conditions, and law enforcement aviation units requested his weather guidance for time-sensitive flight operations. Marcus's unique combination of meteorological expertise and pilot qualifications allowed him to understand both the atmospheric science behind weather phenomena and the practical implications of those conditions for different types of combinous aircraft operations. He could communicate weather information in terms that pilots immediately understood, while providing atmospheric analysis that exceeded standard weather forecasting accuracy and detail. The business success enabled Marcus to upgrade his weather monitoring equipment and establish partnerships with specialized atmospheric research organizations that provided access to advanced meteorological models and real-time data feeds. His weather analysis capabilities became sophisticated enough to support complex aviation operations that other meteorological services couldn't handle safely. Marcus also began providing weather-related flight training for pilots who needed enhanced meteorological knowledge for specialized aviation operations. His instruction combined atmospheric science principles with practical flying experience, teaching pilots how to interpret complex weather information and make informed flight decisions in challenging atmospheric conditions. The training programs attracted pilots from medical helicopter services, search and rescue organizations, agricultural aviation companies, and experimental aircraft programs that required enhanced weather knowledge for safe operations. Marcus's reputation as both meteorologist and pilot gave his instruction credibility that theoretical weather education couldn't provide. 3 years after his first educational flight with Tom Bradley, Marcus had transformed his career from overlooked weather specialist to sought-after aviation meteorology consultant, whose expertise was recognized throughout the region. His client base included major hospitals, emergency services organizations, aircraft manufacturers, and specialized aviation companies that required precision weather analysis for critical operations. Marcus purchased his own aircraft, a well-equipped Cessna 206, that provided both personal transportation and a platform for atmospheric research flights that enhanced his understanding of weather phenomena. The airplane allowed him to experience atmospheric conditions firsthand, while collecting meteorological data that improved his weather analysis capabilities for aviation clients. The aircraft also enabled Marcus to provide on-site weather support for clients located throughout the western United States, establishing his consulting practice as a regional resource for specialized aviation meteorology services. His reputation spread through aviation networks as the weather specialist who could enable safe flight operations in conditions that other meteorologists declared unflyable. Marcus's most significant recognition came when he was invited to speak at the National Business Aviation Association's annual convention about the integration of advanced meteorological analysis with flight operations. His presentation attracted widespread attention from aviation professionals who recognized the safety and operational advantages that specialized weather expertise could provide. The convention presentation led to consulting contracts with major corporations that operated flight departments, requiring enhanced weather support for business aviation missions. Marcus began providing meteorological services for international flights, specialized aircraft operations, and corporate aviation programs that demanded precision weather analysis beyond standard forecasting capabilities. Marcus also began writing technical articles for aviation magazines about meteorological topics that affected flight safety and efficiency. His articles bridged the gap between atmospheric science and practical flying operations, helping pilots understand weather phenomena that standard flight training covered only superficially. The technical writing enhanced Marcus's reputation within aviation meteorology communities and led to invitations for guest lectures at universities and flight training organizations. His unique perspective as both practicing meteorologist and active pilot provided insights that purely academic meteorology education couldn't match. As Marcus's expertise became widely recognized, he received an offer from the Federal Aviation Administration to lead development of next-generation weather services specifically designed for general aviation and specialized flight operations. The position would allow him to apply his knowledge nationally while influencing how meteorological information was provided to pilots throughout the aviation system. Marcus accepted the FAA position while maintaining his consulting practice, recognizing that government service would provide platforms for improving aviation weather services on scales that individual consulting couldn't achieve. His appointment was celebrated throughout aviation communities that had benefited from his specialized meteorological expertise and innovative approaches to flight weather support. The weather specialist who had been overlooked in basement conference rooms had become the pilot whose meteorological expertise was transforming how aviation weather services supported flight safety and efficiency. Marcus's journey from forgotten forecaster to essential aviation professional demonstrated how combining scientific knowledge with practical experience could create career opportunities that neither qualification alone would have provided. Marcus's success inspired other meteorologists to pursue aviation training and encouraged pilots to develop enhanced weather analysis skills, creating a new generation of aviation professionals who understood both atmospheric science and flight operations. His legacy extended beyond individual career achievement to influence how the aviation industry integrated meteorological expertise with flight safety and operational efficiency. The transformation was complete. The methodical, patient analyst who had spent years studying atmospheric patterns in isolation, had become an indispensable member of the aviation community, whose weather expertise enabled safe flight operations that saved lives and advanced aviation capabilities. Marcus Chen had found the perfect intersection of scientific knowledge and practical application, creating a career that combined his analytical strengths with his passion for flight in ways that served the broader aviation community while providing personal satisfaction that his previous work had never delivered.